Hey guys, today I want to talk about the worst books that I have read so far this year in 2023. I've read 70 books so far, and I did a video of the best ones, the ones that I've loved the most, and then I wanted to do a video of the top 5 ones that I have enjoyed the least, but specifically I want to do it to share some lessons behind each of them and just try and help you with discerning what books you should read, what books you should try again, which ones you should just dump, and kind of all that. I felt like there were some pretty good lessons in these, and so that's what we're going to do today. So the first one that we're going to talk about is The Master and Margarita. This is a book that was recommended on a recommended reading list by Jordan Peterson, who I absolutely love. And so I had just bought a copy of it and was like, sweet, like I'm going to dig into this. And I started reading it and I was like, man, I don't really like this. Like, I don't know. And I kept reading. And I was like, dude, if Jordan Peterson hadn't recommended this, I would not be reading this book. And it was like, and I kind of, forced my way through it and I got done and ended. And I was like, I just don't like it. Like I got nothing out of that book. I absolutely hated it. And the lesson that I wanted to take from that was just, you're always going to have a swing and a miss sometimes, right? Even when I have somebody like Jordan Peterson, who is one of my favorite authors and speakers and just people like on the planet right now, he just had a random list of recommended reads and I have no idea why he recommended that one. Maybe there was something in it that, I didn't see, or maybe he was recommending it because it was terrible. And here's an example of what not to do, I don't know. But it just brought me back to this realization of like, don't put anyone on a pedestal. Don't put an author that you like on a pedestal. Don't put me on a pedestal. Like anything that anybody says, take with a grain of salt and don't force yourself to like it just because someone who you admire likes it, right? The hard part for me was like, oh, well, Jordan Peterson recommended this book, so obviously I should like it. When in reality, I'm like, I hated it. And I didn't even like it enough to want to go in and try to read it again in order to understand it so that I maybe can like it. Like I just hated it. I threw it away when I was done with it. I just did not like it, right? And that's okay. I don't have to feel guilty just because someone who I look up to recommended it, right? Next up, we had the Anthropocene Reviewed. So the lesson for me in this book was that if you do a deep reading and you really dig into a book, sometimes what you'll find is that the message of it is actually completely opposite of what the message of it seems to be. And that was my experience with this book. Everybody that I knew that had, as I was reading about was talking about how hopeful this book was. But when I sat down and really tried to work through it all in my own head, basically what I came out with was like, yes, you're trying to write a hopeful book, but the foundation that this book is built on precludes there being any hope. And basically just there is no option other than having hope is pointless. So you can't start from this base assumption that hope is pointless and then write a book about hope and have me actually come away being like, oh, this is hopeful, right? It just didn't work. So you can watch, I'll link that up here somewhere, but you can watch my video on that because I really tried to delve into some of those thoughts. Again, the lesson from this one was just this idea of read deeply. And sometimes what you'll find is if you do a cursory reading of something, you might like it, but then when you really dig into it more, it just doesn't hold water. It doesn't hold up, right? And good books and great books, they hold up. Like the deeper you dig into them, the stronger they get, the more firm of a foundation that they have. And this one just felt like the further I dig, the more sandy and soft and just disappearing the foundation became. So that was my second one. My third one was the Earthsea Cycle, but specifically the last two, really kind of the last 3 books in that series. And this was one of the ones that started out wonderful. Like I loved the first book and I thought that I kind of knew the direction that she was going to go with these and this opportunity to do all this really, really cool stuff. Instead, what happened was specifically in the context of this book, when you look at the idea of feminism and what she was trying to communicate about feminism, and what I felt like was instead of having a book in a world where she sets up this thing that there's this huge inequality to women, and then now we have this story and this journey where the world changes and men's mindsets change and there becomes equality at the end of it. Really all that happened was she, in like the third book, just kind of like flipped this switch, I felt like. And then instead of there being like, oh, men are here and there's inequality with the women, then she just flipped it and it's like, okay, now women are here and men are down here. And then we got to the end and it was like, and now we're exactly where we started out with, only flip-flopped. And so it didn't feel like there was any resolution to me of of actually bringing growth in any of the characters or growth into any of the situations. And then on top of that, reading the introductions and the afterwards and stuff that Ursula had for these books, it felt to me like she kept saying, I didn't politicize Earthsea, and I didn't try to preach, stuff that was going on in the real world. I didn't write it into my stories. And I just came away from feeling this like, yes, you totally did. Like, don't, like, you can't say that you didn't. You 100% did. Like, the first book and the last book are polar opposites, but there was no clear path and progression in between them. They just like switched all of a sudden in the book whenever you talked about like, oh, now I decided to write what the story was trying to tell me, which just happened to align with all the feminist movement that was happening at the time and whatever. And again, it was a lot of this thing of like, I don't care that you did that, but it was just incongruent is what it felt like to me. And so the lesson that I took from that one was this whole idea of, especially when you come to series, it's so weird that you can have series where each book, is only maybe like 3 or 4 stars, but then the series as a whole, when you get done with everything, you're like, oh, 5 stars. Like, that was so good. I loved it. Or you can kind of have the opposite, where you can have like the first book, you're like, oh, 5 stars. This is great. And then the next book, you're like, I don't know. And then the third book, you're like, crap. Well, that sucked. And so it just brought to mind this reminder to me of like, don't judge a series by a single book, And so like I read the first book and I was like, man, I love this. I'm going to get this. And then I got it and I bought the whole, I think you can kind of see it back there somewhere. The whole cycle, the massive book. And then I got done with it and I'm like, man, I would never recommend this for the reasons that I thought I was going to be able to recommend it. And so now I'm kind of bummed that I own the whole thing because I didn't really like it in the end. I loved the first book, but I didn't like the whole story as a whole. And so just this idea of, don't judge the whole story by one book. And try to, even if you love one book, give it time to play out, because what you might find is that the story changes, or more specifically in this case, like the author changed. And I'm not holding that against her. Like, that's totally fine. I get where she's coming at with all this stuff. But what happened to me was it changed the story in a way that I just couldn't relate to it. And more important, changed it in a way that felt disingenuous to me in my experience of it. And so, so just don't judge the whole series by one book, right? Always keep that in mind. And then the fourth book that I wanted to talk about was Blood Meridian. This was the most interesting one to me to not like, because I basically went back and forth between rating this like 2 stars and 5 stars, because I know I should rate it 5 stars. This book was the perfect example of the difference between a book that you didn't like, that you just got rid of, like Master and Margarita, versus a book that you didn't like, that you keep because you know you need to grow into it, right? And so Blood Meridian for me was this book that I got done with, and I felt like, oh man, like I need to go back to this. Like, there was enough in it that was just gripping me that I was like, like I think I get what you're saying, but I'm not totally sure. And I think the way that you said that is like beautiful and perfect, but I'm not 100% sure. Like, it might just be complication for the sake of complication, which goes like fully against everything that I believe. And so, so the difference that was just so striking to me was having these books that getting done with it, I'm like, I didn't like it, right? Same thing as Master and Margarita, but Master and Margarita had nothing in it to make it worth my while to try to dig into it again, whereas Blood Meridian had enough in it, and I have specific recommendations of that book from people who I trust enough to make me go, okay, you know what? I'm just going to put it on the shelf and I'm going to give it a little bit of time, and I'm going to come back to it at some point later. It'll be the right book to come to again, and I'm going to engage with it again, and I'm going to see how my growth in that time has led me to a place where I can have a new understanding and a new appreciation of this book. And so the lesson out of that was just this idea that even if you don't like it now, if it's a great book and you have a solid confidence that it is a great book and that it's really worth your time, then it's okay to not like it and just put it on the shelf and be like, you know what? I'm going to come to it again later. Like, I'm going to come back to it because I want to grow. This book is so far above me and I want to grow into it because I think it's worth growing into. And that's the case with a lot of like great books. That's Mortimer Adler talks about this. Like, the definition of a great book is it has to be beyond your grasp, and you have to be able to expand your understanding and expand yourself in order to grasp it. And so Blood Meridian felt like one of those books that was like, man, this is above me. And in this reading of it, I couldn't expand my thinking and my everything enough to really grasp a very good amount of it. But I was able to grasp enough to know like, all right, I'm gonna do this one again at some point in the future. And then the fifth one that I wanted to talk about was the ninth Jack Sparrow book. William asked me to read this one from the library. He was like, Dad, I want to read a pirate book, because he loves the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtracks. So he's like, oh, I want to read a book about Jack Sparrow. So I got that and I read this. And the lesson for me on this was specifically for kids' books. And it was just that I looked at this book and I'm like, okay, this is the reading level that this book is at. And the message of it and the morals behind it and the story in and of itself and just everything about it, I got done with it and I was just like, dude, there are so many better options that are just as easy to read, that are just as accessible to someone who is at this level. It doesn't matter what level you are at. There's always going to be books that are just not great. And then a very few books that are at that same level, but that are like truly, genuinely great books that will make you a better person for having read them. And so the goal is to not spend your time reading the ones that are just like, meh, like that Jack Sparrow one. It was fine. I was just like, yeah, it's fine. Like there was no real lesson to it. There was no real point to it. There was no great storyline. It was just like, plot and moving forward and happened and resolution and haha, we're done, right? But on that same reading level, I have tons of other books that I know that I can offer to him that are books that, are like genuinely funny, like hilarious books, or books that are funny, but you have to really think about it and you have to work to get them, or books that teach a great lesson, like I just read Charlotte's Web and I'm like, man, there's so many deep things in this, or books like the Green Ember series, for me that are like specifically from a Christian perspective that are trying to present the gospel and what a Christ-centered life looks like for my kid at this age, that are just infinitely better than any of these books. And so that one was really just that idea of like, dude, don't waste time. You don't have time to read all of the books out there. And so don't waste your time reading books that are just not that great, that just don't add any value to you. There's an infinite number of good books and a very few number of great books that you can read at any level. And your goal should be to focus on reading those. So that's what I want to talk about today. Hopefully that helps. Let me know. Let me know what your least favorite read of the year was. I'm kind of interested. I didn't really want this to be like a super bashing video of like, oh, how terrible all these things are. Because at the end of the day, good can come from all of these, right? Good can come out of all this, and learning the lesson of the failure of reading a book that I didn't like, right? What I want to be able to do is take the lesson out of it and make something good come of it next time. So hopefully that helps. And make sure you subscribe if you're not already, and leave me a comment. Let me know what your least favorite book of the year has been so far. And I'll talk to you in the next one. Bye.